So this PowerPoint is about how Scrooge changes in A Christmas Carol, but I just thought I'd show you this first slide, which is some of the things you could include in more or less any introduction to the novel. I'm just going to let you have a look at them, think about which ones you could use and which ones you know you could say in pretty much anything that you write. So here we have a slide which I hope will help us to understand what I want you to know. We've got this idea of Scrooge as solitary as an oyster, and the picture right in the middle is of an oyster, and that's Dickens' description of it. And I want us to think about how the character Scrooge changes. Actually, what really happens is we move from the outside of Scrooge and the external person to the interior, where there's a pearl. If you look at the two pictures, on the left we have this miserable face shaded in darkness, and on the right there we have a light picture. Scrooge is smiling. He's also carrying another human being, which is also a symbol, by the way, of supporting and of looking after others. So down the left hand side we have some quotes that I'd like us to just quickly think about. Same on the right, and down the middle there are these four really great words you can use to describe what happens to Scrooge. Okay, so metamorphosis is one, is actually that's about physical change. Two, having an epiphany. Sometimes we talk about that in school as having a light bulb moment where you realize something and you change everything. It changes everything, which leads to a transformation. You change, which also means that you are redeemed, which another word I want you to think about is that you gain redemption, that somehow the bad things that you've done are made up for in the good things that you continue to do in your life. And along the top there you can see that we've got Marley, the ghost of Marley, Jacob Marley, the spirit or the ghost of the Christmas past, the spirit ghost of Christmas present, and the spirit yet to come. They all contribute, of course, to us changing our view of Scrooge and us realizing moving from the outside to the inside. So down the left we have these quotations. We've got the idea that he's tight-fisted. That little tiny quote comes from a great long list of descriptions that Dickens uses to describe Scrooge and his greed and his parsimoniousness, which is a really great word for greed. The idea that he iced his office. He physically iced his office because he refused to let Cratchit have more than one tiny little nugget of coal. But this is the idea that he carries coldness everywhere he goes. He is the weather, if you like. He says "bah humbug," another phrase that has become kind of famous when referring to Christmas. And he accuses poor old Cratchit of stealing from him for wanting Christmas Day off. His attitude to Christmas is that it's a day like any other and should be used for making money. So he says it's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket to steal from him. And of course, when he's asked for help by the charitable workers at the beginning of the novel, he gives them a list of things that he contributes to. In other words, he pays tax, he pays money towards looking after them, and he just wonders why the prisons aren't a good place to look after people who suffer at Christmas. And then he says one of the most shocking things, or perhaps the most shocking thing, which is that if anyone is ill, then a child should die and decrease the surplus population. In other words, if it's a problem, maybe it dying would be better than if it exists in the society that we live in. This comes from a fancy idea by somebody called Malthus, which is an economic idea, that there's only so much resources in the world and therefore there should only be so many people. But nevertheless, that paints a very, very dark portrait of a man without any fellow feeling, and particularly at Christmas when this becomes more highlighted. So we obviously have our changes, and then we end up with our character on the right there. You could look, can't you? You can see the frown on the left, you can see the smile on the right, you can see the darkness on the left, and you can see the light on the right, and the fact that he's just with another human being, a small boy, Tiny Tim, who needs his help. And of course, by the end of it, when he was accusing Cratchit of stealing from him, now he's saying, "I'll raise your salary, Bob, and endeavour," that means try, "to assist your struggling family." So he's going to help. And if we take "bah humbug" on the left, on the right, he says, "I will honour Christmas in my heart." In other words, he becomes somebody who treats Christmas seriously, that it's something that really means something to him, where he says, "Christmas in my heart." So I suggest you print out this slide because it's got some quotations that you might be able to use from Marley, from The Ghost of Christmas Past, The Ghost of Christmas Present, and The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Not many, just a few quotations that I think might be useful and that will help you to show this transformation. So on the left, you can see that Marley says things like, "I wear the chain I forged in life." In other words, he's suffering now for the things he did when he was alive. And he says he made it link by link and yard by yard. That's Dickens using repetition, of course, but it's also talking about the chain, isn't it? That each of the individual things he did every day created that chain. I suppose it also suggests that if Scrooge were to do one good thing, it might be enough to break the chain that could lead him to be in the same place, which is, of course, what Marley warns him. At the very bottom there, it says, "I'm here tonight to warn you that you have a chance of escaping my fate." So this is all about kind of making Scrooge aware of what's going to happen, because, of course, Marley tells him that he's going to be visited by the next three spirits. I think it also helps Dickens, because Dickens wants us to make sure that actually Scrooge believes in ghosts and in spirits, because if he doesn't believe in the next three to come, then the story falls apart. So he makes Scrooge believe in Marley, and he makes Marley prepare him for what's about to come. So then we get a bunch of quotations from The Ghost of Christmas Past. Of course, that's where Scrooge is taken back into his own past, and you begin to see, well, maybe some of the reasons why Scrooge is like he is, the idea that he was left alone. Okay, but I think one of the interesting things is just to think a little bit about the description of The Ghost of Christmas Past, because it's kind of looks a bit like a child, but actually look harder and you'll see an old man, and it's carrying symbols of Christmas but symbols of summer flowers as well. You just get this idea that this spirit can travel through time and represents now and represents the past all at once. And of course it shines a light into the past, this big jet of light that shines into the past. And of course we're taken, the first thing we see is Scrooge, and my third quotation down there, it says, "A lonely boy was sat reading near a feeble fire." The feeble fire, not too dissimilar to the feeble fire that he makes poor old Cratchit sit next to. But it's this lonely boy, and that's our first indication that we meet this child who's been neglected. A neglected child, I think, who's left to rot in a school without much care for years and years. And it affects him. We know it affects him because the spirit points out that his lip is trembling. Scrooge is trembling, and actually eventually there are tears from Scrooge. And we also see him visiting his first boss, Fezziwig, and I like just to think about the name, the way that Dickens uses a name. Fezziwig sounds fun. Just the sound of his name sounds fun, and it fizzes, it sounds like it's full of energy, as Fezziwig is. And if you compare that with Scrooge, that name certainly doesn't scream energy at all. It's a very sour sounding name. Now, at this point, Scrooge is still a little bit resentful of what's happening to him, which is why the ghost pinions him down. And to pinion somebody is to pin them down, to fix them, to stop them moving. And it's what the spirit does. And given that it's just like a child, this is a remarkable feat, but it pins him and it makes him watch, it makes him stay, it makes him face up to what he needs to see. And he needs to see Belle, his former love, walk away from him. And she says, "May you be happy in the life you have chosen." And I think this is yet another example of where we see Scrooge begin to thaw a little bit because there is a tear in his eye. We move on to The Ghost of Christmas Present, and so this is the third column in red. And what we notice there is that he has to discover it. There's an act of him having to do some work. It's been sitting in his room for a while waiting for him, and he hasn't discovered that there is a light coming in from under the door. So Scrooge has to go to the spirit. This is a big jolly giant, as you see, and it's sitting on a mound of food, a mound of all the things that we associate with Christmas today, but it's bountiful. There's just an absolute stack of this that this spirit is sitting on, and it just reminds us that Scrooge has access to these things if he wants them. His riches can bring these things, which is then brought in stark contrast to where Scrooge is taken, which is to the Cratchits, of course, and we see that they don't have everything, that they make the best of everything, that their conversations about such a goose that they have to eat is all exaggeration, because they are desperate for everybody to be happy, and yet they are spreading what little they can afford very thinly in order to please the children and to please themselves as well. And we also see that the Ghost of Christmas Present, it takes him across the land, across all of Britain, to some strange places, underground into mines, into small houses, onto a ship at one point, just to show that the spirit of Christmas lives everywhere in Britain at this time. And eventually we land back at Fred's house, where he sees and begins to thaw himself again. We see him actually enjoying the games that are being played in Fred's house. So it's a real voyage to discover the spirit of Christmas in everyone. But then Dickens undercuts all this jolliness that he starts to see, because Scrooge begins to enjoy himself. And as the Ghost of Christmas Present is about to die, because of course it can only live as long as the day, it reveals the boy and the girl ignorance and want. And so we see the difference in tone from the jollity to who these two children are. And of course they're presented as awful, desperate people with claws, and the Ghost of Christmas Present leaves with a warning that we should beware these. And I think this is yet another example of showing that he needs to change. And what happens here is that he gets his words repeated back to him. The Ghost of Christmas Present repeats the words that Scrooge uses at the beginning of the novel when he talks to the charity workers. He talks about are there no prisons? And now, to Scrooge's ears, they sound ridiculous. His own words sound terrible to him, which is yet more proof that he is changing. If we move finally to the spirit of yet to come, of Christmas yet to come, we have a very different looking spirit. It's a phantom, and it moves slowly, gravely, seriously, silently. Now we don't hear it speak, and we don't see its face, and one of my theories on that is, of course, that it could be him, that he's actually coming from the future to warn himself that if he carries on and behaves as he has been, he will be this phantom. And we see that he's taking this very seriously, because Scrooge says, "I fear you more than any spectre." A spectre is another word for a ghost. "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen." Okay, and he's taken, and he realises that his death has happened. Eventually, he realises that his death has happened. Dickens plays with Scrooge here. We all know who everyone is talking about, this dead man that nobody cares about. But Scrooge either doesn't want to or hasn't seen that what's being talked about is him. And eventually we are led to his grave, one of those famous scenes in literature where we see eventually what we've always known is there, and what he sees eventually, that in this place overrun by grass and weeds is a tombstone with his name on it. And he says to the spirit, "Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone." In other words, that something, even a sponge with some water, might get rid of the name on the stone. In other words, how can I make sure that I don't die and I am not this person in this unlovely, unwanted grave that nobody cares about? So he thinks that perhaps some kind of purification, I suppose, if you're sponging and cleaning things away, it's about kind of being pure again, isn't it? So I think that's what that quote is about. And then it shrinks, it disappears, the spirit disappears, and all that's left is the bedpost that he was looking at all the time. This idea actually comes from the Gothic fiction, that it's something that can be explained, that this spirit can be explained, that he wakes up and perhaps, just perhaps, it was all a dream. But it doesn't matter, because we know that these events, the places he's seen, the past that he's been asked to revisit, the life he knows he could never leave with Belle because he failed, and the things he's seen at the Cratchits in the present, the things he knows he can do about because they're happening now, they're happening right now because he's just woken up on Christmas Day, the things he can fix, and he knows that, and that's why he changes.